Politico just put out an article which essentially said that the Chinese people hate us, Americans especially. But they followed that up. That wasn't enough. They also had to tweet about their article with this. Trump is getting roasted on Chinese Twitter for his virus response, highlighting a broad verdict there. America disastrously faltered, while China outperformed. Okay, hold up. When you say things like English Twitter or French Twitter, usually what you mean is the users of Twitter in that particular place. For example, you'll talk about what the French people are talking about on Twitter, you might say French Twitter as shorthand. But when you say Chinese Twitter, or when Politico says Chinese Twitter, they can't mean that, because the Chinese people aren't allowed on Twitter. It's just a little bit too free. I know, it's not free, but it is for the Chinese, by denigrated Chinese standards. So Twitter is banned in China because the people might criticize the president of China or something like that. So when Politico says Chinese Twitter, they actually mean the social networks that are produced by the Chinese government or the Chinese Communist Party that people in China are permitted to use. These are social networks which are heavily monitored by the Chinese government and on which people can be tracked. These networks essentially exist to identify thought criminals like honeypots that are intended to attract dissidents to their doom. That's what we're talking about when Politico says Chinese Twitter. I mean, is it any wonder that the people on those networks compliment the Chinese regime, with all of its authoritarianness, and criticize the US? Wouldn't you? I mean, Chinese people who do critique the regime under which they live, they disappear. Then their organs are put to use somewhere. That's what we're really talking about. The reason that I'm bringing this Politico article and tweet your attention is because it matters that the American media is now running propaganda for the Chinese Communist Party. That's what's happening. That's why the American media called us racist when we referred to the Chinese coronavirus as the Chinese coronavirus or as the Wuhan coronavirus. We used that term because it was a coronavirus, a type of virus, from China, specifically from Wuhan, China. It wasn't racist to call it that, but the mainstream media pretended that it was, because they wanted massive separation between this virus and China, or, separation from the virus and the Chinese government, the Communist Party. They're defending the Chinese government. That's what it was all about. That's why they called us racist, because they wouldn't want us all criticizing the Chinese government, which, by the way, is probably the most evil force on the planet right now. Yeah. A recent article in the Federalist listed some of the most overt connections between mainstream media outlets and the Chinese Communist Party. And just to give you a spoiler, basically every mainstream media outlet has massive financial connections to the Chinese Communist Party or to corporations over there in China who are connected to the Chinese Communist Party. Because there is no real capitalism over there. If you run it like a big company, you're essentially doing business for the Chinese Communist Party. Yeah. We don't have a truly free press if our media is working for the Chinese Communist Party. That's why this is so significant. And by the way, big tech is embroiled in this too, and have some of the same connections. And big tech works to suppress and black hole alternative media. So the sort of scenario that we're looking at now is that the media, the mainstream media, works to complement, quite literally, the Chinese government and the Chinese regime, as we saw in that Politico article, and big tech works to prevent any corrections to what the media puts forth and to prevent any competition. In shows like this one, that they bury the shows. They sometimes censor them outright and say, nope, you're gone, you're off of our platform. That's the way big tech works, and I think everybody knows it at this point. But this China connection is something that is so often ignored or simply concealed by, our media. Yes, they work together in a sort of conspiracy to keep us in the dark between the media and big tech. as in the dark as those Chinese citizens that are supposedly so critical of the United States regime, and so complimentary of the Chinese government. But all of this is getting worse every year. And honestly, it seems so obvious to me that Senator Joseph McCarthy was right in the 1950s when he said that communists are everywhere, they're littering our institutions. When you look at Hollywood, the media, big tech, the colleges, they're infested with communists. It seems that we need a new House Un-American Activities Committee. And there's no wonder that the colleges and university system now slam Senator Joseph McCarthy so much, because the colleges themselves are infested. The professors are communists. Many of them are open about the fact that they're communists, something that certainly didn't happen back then. It could be inferred that the real reason that the media hates Trump as they do is because not so much of our freedoms necessarily, not directly, but because of Trump's trade war with China. Because of the fact that 10 and maybe even 20 years before Trump ran for election, he was talking about the problems with China and our unbalanced trade, how the Chinese are basically allowed, or Chinese government rather, is allowed to cheat, and they're responsible for American wages being so low in a sense, because we're exporting all of our jobs over there to China where they can pay their people slave labor. In fact, many of the Chinese products that some people herald as being great and cheap are produced by prisoners, by political dissidents. And that's something that we should celebrate? I certainly don't think so. Anyway, back to Politico and their heralding of what's going on over in Chinese social media. Back in 2016, not that long ago, Western media sources were talking about this study by Harvard, believe it or not, professors who had done a study and figured out that when you look at those Chinese social media sources, well, it's all fake. The Chinese government pays what you might call trolls to create 488 million fake posts a year, just completely fake, to compliment the Chinese government for its great job and to criticize, the United States and how it operates. 488 million fake posts on their social media platforms. And again, this was reported back in 2016 by the mainstream media. Not anymore, but the whole point of these posts, these fake posts that are going on over there in their media system, is to make Chinese would-be dissidents feel like they're alone. Feel like their opinions, their inner critiques of the Chinese regime are, well, unwarranted, or in the very least, that they should feel isolated, that they should keep their opinions to themselves, because clearly they're alone in having them. Everybody else loves living under this system, where they're constantly tracked, where they're afraid of being dragged away to a concentration camp. Everybody else is perfectly happy, and the United States is the big, boogeyman or something. That's what these posts are for, and it's interesting, because that very pattern, that very method, is used by big tech, actually. Like, for example, it was discovered by Project Veritas when they did some undercover reporting for over at Twitter, that Twitter's methods of hiding people's posts, shadow banning or deboosting, depending on who you ask, was all about a psychological game to make people feel like they're alone and that their opinions are isolated if their opinions did not, agree with what the leaders of Twitter thought, for example. So if you were there with your MAGA hat in your profile, for example, you wouldn't find other people who agreed with you over on Twitter. This was, again, discovered by Project Veritas. But the whole aim of it was to make those people feel like there were no other people who felt as they did, that they were overwhelmed by the opposition. It's a game, but it's the same game that the Chinese government plays. These people, by the way, over in China, who work for the Chinese government posting these fake posts all day, they're referred to negatively by the Chinese people as Wu Mao, or 50 centers. Apparently, Wu Mao means 50 cent. It's slang for the 50 Chinese cents that allegedly these people receive for every post. Every post they do, they get 50 Chinese cents. Every post that's, that heralds the awesomeness of the Chinese government or criticizes capitalism and so on. So that should tell you what it's really like over on Chinese Twitter, as Politico likes to say. Yes, the people that Politico is just heralding as wonderful for criticizing the US response to the virus are fake. They're simply working for the Chinese government. And really, Politico ought to know better, and I find it very hard to believe that Politico doesn't know better. I honestly think that they do, and that they don't care. Wait, if you enjoyed that video, please remember to like and share. I can't grow without you. Also, if you want to be reliably notified of new videos, don't forget to subscribe to the newsletter. If you're able to support the production of these videos, I'd appreciate it if you'd subscribe at Subscribestar, or maybe get one of the healthier products, or even get some merch.